What's up, hobby friends? In this week's video, we're going to be experimenting with Sprue Goo. This is something that I've learned about recently and I've been meaning to try, but really haven't had the opportunity to, largely because I've been having trouble sourcing the Tamiya Extra Thin. I actually had to eBay this from somewhere in China, and it took a couple of weeks to send through. So now that I have it in hand, I wanted to give it a try and sort of record my experience with this material in gap filling some of my Horus Heresy Deimos predators. So the materials I'll be using: Tamiya Extra Thin Cement. I've got a spare glass container that I'll be using to mix the actual quantity of Sprue Goo I need. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to make a small amount of the Sprue Goo, just enough to fill the bottom layer with sprue. We'll use a bit of the cement and then we'll see how it goes. So I've got a glass container, and then I've also got some spare sprue that I'll be cutting apart to make the Sprue Goo with. So I've got the sprue clipped up and I've got it in the container. I'm aiming to have just enough sprue to cover the bottom of the jar and then add a little bit more so it's not just super thin. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using the Tamiya cement, and I'll be using the actual brush tip itself to help drop the liquid in. Bit of a spill, but I'm not too overly concerned. So the amount of plastic cement that, as I understand I want, is to have just enough to cover the top of the sprue with a little bit extra. So I've got that in there. I'm going to seal this jar up. And the current time is 12:52. So I'm going to keep track of the time for this entire process, this entire experiment, and we're going to see exactly how long it takes for the sprue to dissolve. I'm going to let this mixture sit, and then we'll come back and see where we're at in a couple hours. So the time is now 2:50, so we're looking at about a couple of hours after we've created our initial mix, and you can see that it has dissolved quite a bit of it, but it's still kind of chunky. And my fear or my concern right now is that the plastic glue is a little oversaturated with the plastic sprue bits for now. So I'm using an old dental tool, a metal tool, just to stir this. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit more of this Tamiya Extra Thin. I'm going to give it a stir just to introduce some new cement in there, try and mix in or goop in the rest of it. And I'm going to let it sit for another hour or two and then see where we're at, see if it dissolves any further. And then we'll start to give it a test on some spare plastic parts that we have assembled. But even just by using the tool to manually stir now, you can see that it's already starting to break down. So I think it's important just to keep an eye on the plastic mixture as you're waiting for it to sort of melt down, and just give it a stir, almost like you're cooking or baking. You have to just stir the materials and make sure that it all dissolves and breaks down smoothly and evenly. So it is 3:19, and so just about a little over a half hour since we mixed the Sprue Goo mix, and I have been basically checking it periodically, mixing it every couple of minutes, and it's about as mixed as it's going to get. I don't think that we're going to see any sort of further breakdown of the plastic sprue. So I think this, as my first learning, is I probably put in a little too much sprue and or not enough cement, which we'll find out from this experiment how long this sprue actually lasts, but it might be that you make it in smaller doses or smaller batches and go in, I guess, smaller amounts. But for now, I think we're going to go with this mix. We're going to try and see what it looks like, how it works. I'm going to be trying this on an inconspicuous part of the model, somewhere that is a bit of a gap that will require sanding, that isn't difficult to get to. So I will be using this Deimos Predator. Now on the side of this vehicle, the actual exhaust covers all of the seams for the hull plates. So I think this will be a good place to actually try it out. So we're going to do it on this part right here and here, and then we'll see how quickly it takes to dry and how sandable it is, and then we'll give it a prime, see what the finish ends up looking like. So the Sprue Goo itself, because it is using plastic cement, you want to make sure that the applicator or the brush, whatever you're using, is not plastic or made of a plastic material. So I will be using an old sable brush for this, not a synthetic, because the synthetic being plastic will break down in the plastic cement. At least with this sable brush, it'll not break apart in the plastic cement, and I don't foresee it being washable and reusable, but I do have some water on hand just to keep it clear. I want to actually see when I use it or when I actually start applying it for this entire Predator Squadron, how long this brush will actually go for applying the Sprue Goo. So I'm just going to take a bit of it, and we're just going to apply it to the Predator. So one of the reasons I actually wanted to try this recipe, or using this technique as opposed to Milliput, is given the amount of gaps that these new Horus Heresy tanks have, it's really painful to try and mix together Milliput, get it in place, smooth it out, sand it down, especially in a lot of these corner elements, like on the top hatch, right along this entire thing, there is a seam running back and forth, and it is honestly a pain in the ass. I don't like it. It takes too long, so I wanted to see if this would be a quicker way to at the very least, get a mix down and applied to the model. Okay, so I've got the stopwatch running, and we've applied it. We're going to see how long this Sprue Goo actually takes to cure, and then when it cures, how sandable it's going to be. It's a little over 15 minutes since we applied the Sprue Goo, and you can see here on this side right here where I've sort of just periodically sort of tested the material, tested how sandable it is, and I would say for thin globs, a very thin layer of the Sprue Goo, you're probably looking at about 5 minutes for it to dry. So these lower portions where it was fairly thin, and even a little bit up here, were fairly easy to sand and were pretty much fully cured by about the 5-minute mark. Sanded pretty easily. I just used some fine grit. I think this is 600 grit paper. Did that for my initial sanding, and then I switched to a 1200 grit sanding sponge. And this is essentially my polishing. It removes a lot of the imperfections, especially on these larger flat areas. And when you sand in a circular motion, it'll help to hide some of the rougher patches from the 600 grit and smooth it out for the primer. So on this one little element here, I did glob it on fairly thickly. So it did take a little longer. You saw just over 15 minutes. It does appear fully cured to the touch. So I'm going to start with my, again, 600 grit, and we're just going to sand in a circular motion. And that's pretty good. It sands pretty much just like plastic would, so the Sprue Goo is working exactly as expected. I think if you do glob it on, you have to spend a little bit more time sanding it smooth, and then especially the edges where it meets the actual original plastic, you'll have to spend a bit more time sanding it smooth, otherwise it will show up in the primer. So a little bit more time with the fine grit as well as with the sanding sponge is required if you are laying on a thick layer. Less so on these thinner ones. I found these sanded pretty easily with no effort. And they feel relatively smooth to the touch. Honestly, if they were applied thinly enough on very thin seams, you could probably skip the sanding paper altogether, go right into the fine grit sanding sponge, and just smooth it right out. It'll buff right down. So that feels pretty good to me. Pretty smooth to the touch. No different than if I were to be using Milliput to fill a gap and then sanding it smooth. And I think the finish, it feels like it would with the Milliput. I think once you prime it, we'll end up with almost the same kind of finish. So here are a couple of Predators that I've done. I started this one with a bit of Milliput, and you can see on the backs of them, I did some Milliput as well. I kind of got fed up with it, and that's sort of where this experiment for the Sprue came out about. I wanted to try it, see how it actually fit, just because when doing the Rhino before this one, and then in starting to do the Predators, I found the Milliput incredibly tedious. It got pretty messy in terms of constantly having to mix the amounts of Milliput, smear it in there. I was getting all over my fingers. It was just challenging to work with. And one of the particular issues I have with using Milliput for this kind of a purpose, because of the way I do it, I take my finger and I smear the Milliput over the surface. The advantage is I'm using my finger and moisture to really smooth it down, which minimizes the sanding time and the polishing time I have to do afterwards. The downside is when sanding, and in particular when carving, the milliput is so thin that sometimes it does flake off in chunks. That thinness does become a disadvantage. One of the benefits I found with using Sprue Goo, because it is a plastic cement as part of the mixture, when it seeps into the gaps and it bonds, it's bonding with the existing plastic. So you can see here in some of these flatter areas and in some of these corners, once it gets in there and it bonds, when you start to sand and carve down, the entire thing it's all filled in. It's essentially plastic. This mixture, when fully cured and set, it's like the plastic of the original model. So definitely a plus. I found that actually creating the mixture was easy. Waiting for it to fully mix and having to sort of just watch it periodically, stirring it with the metal stick, wasn't as big an issue as I thought it would be. The slurry itself broke down pretty quickly, a couple of hours and you're ready to go. You're definitely going to be mixing these in small amounts. And the application, yes, you're going to go through quite a few of these sable brushes. I ended up using 2 of these brushes over these 3 tanks, along with the last cannon sponsons, as well as the 12 exhaust vents that go on the tanks. So I did all of that gap filling with the Sprue Goo and only really used 2 brushes. I definitely see the appeal of Sprue Goo. One of the downsides I did find was that, especially in corners where you're not able to sand, or maybe in areas where sanding and getting it perfectly smooth isn't as easy of a task. So for elements where sanding smooth isn't really an option and you need that smooth finish, I think using some sort of sculpting putty, like green stuff, brown stuff, or Milliput, or whatever your putty of choice is, something that you can manipulate and using a sculpting tool smooth out before it's cured is probably the better gap filling tool to use. But when you're tackling big, flat, open surfaces and edges like this, areas where you're able to get in there and sand it sharp and smooth, I definitely think Sprue Goo is the way to go, especially if you're going to be doing this in batch. I do highly recommend that if you do intend to use Sprue Goo, that you try and gap fill your entire, not necessarily an army, but a large batch of models at once, largely because you do have to mix quite a bit of it and you don't want it to go to waste. It is currently 9 p.m. in the evening. So I made this around, I believe it was 12:50. So 1 p.m. today on a Tuesday. And I'm going to let this sit. I'm going to see how long this mixture actually lasts before it starts to harden. It's already started to not solidify, but become much more viscous compared to this afternoon. We'll see how this goes over the next couple of days before I edit the video and upload it to YouTube this Friday. So it is 1:40 on the Thursday. So this is a little over 2 days, 48 hours since we've mixed the Sprue Goo. And I will say that this is lasting much longer than I expected. In fact, letting it sit overnight for probably about another 12 hours has allowed all of the sprue to basically break down and melt in the Tamiya cement. So the mixture is a little more viscous than when I was using it yesterday and the day before. However, it doesn't look like it's curing or setting in the bottle in any significant quantity. And I've been doing some research on just how long this is expected to last, and what I'm hearing is potentially months. In fact, if you add in more sprue or more Tamiya cement, you can thicken it up or thin it out and sort of reactivate the mixture. And so it looks like even mixing in a small amount, keeping it in a relatively sealed container. Again, I don't think this is airtight, but I think it's sealed enough that it's not air curing. This bottle could potentially last a bit. So I think for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to be able to definitively say how long this mixture will last. But what I will do is I'm going to label this with the date and time that I actually created the mix. Let's do that now. 12:50. So I'm going to attach this to the bottle, and I'm actually just going to set this aside, and I'm going to not use this. If I want to use Sprue Goo in the future, I'm going to use my own mixture, a second mixture that I will continue to use, and then I'm going to leave this untouched and see just how long this will actually last before the actual mixture fully sets out or cures out. If it's anything more than a couple of months, a bit of maintenance just to reactivate it by adding a bit more sprue and a bit more of the Tamiya extra thin could actually keep this going indefinitely, and would actually prove as a very good way to quickly gap fill, having this on hand and not having to mix up any milliput when you're doing plastic parts that you can easily sand. So that's it for this video. I'll throw up a couple of turnarounds on the screen of these tanks when they're unprimed, so you can see how they've been gap filled, how they look, and then I'll throw on a primer on them, and you can see exactly how the Sprue Goo finish looks once it's primed. And I hope you enjoyed. I hope my little experiment in the Sprue Goo gave you maybe a little confidence if you want to try it yourself, or maybe it's just not the technique for you. It definitely requires a bit of preparation, and it's not something that you can just pick up and do. If you're looking to gap fill 1 or 2 models or a handful of things, or you want a little bit more control, a little bit more finesse, I would probably recommend using something like Milliput, or again, some sort of gap filling putty or 2-part sculpting putty. When you're doing an army, a lot of models, a lot of big gaps, and you want to go through it quickly with a bit of sanding and sort of just crank them all at once. I definitely think Sprue Goo has its purpose, especially for tabletop models. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.